Konnichiwa.
Welcome to the Jandals in Japan podcast.
Kia ora, Catherine.
Konnichiwa, Jayne.
You're looking very green for our forestry episode today.
I am, aren't I?
Got your
Yes, I
camo
thought
on
I
there.
would get the green, get the camo, get the green on. Exactly. Yeah, we've got a great episode coming up today with Tony Clifford, who's from Pack Forestry Products in New Zealand. Amazing history with Japan and working with this company for 30 years.
Yes, that's amazing, isn't it? You don't
It
often hear
really
of that,
is.
right? Yeah.
It really is. And, you know, he relates to us a little bit about the times that he's had success in working with Japanese people, also the difficult things that have come up, and he's resolved them. And I really like, and I hope that everyone can listen to his advice on being prepared for crises that can come up.
Yes,
Natural disasters and all kinds of things, which is very timely for him to have.
Very timely as we're releasing this on 311 or 311. This year is the 13th anniversary of the triple disaster. And it's easy for me to calculate that because that is how old my daughter will be this year. But yeah, it is a great time to review your plans, review your preparations. Are they still valid? Do I need to change anything, refresh anything, refresh my memory? Where am I going? Who's doing what when these things happen, so that you don't even need to think about it when they happen, right? You just do. And that's what's needed in the moment when these things happen, right? This is why schools and offices practice evacuations, so that when these things strike, they are ready. So please go and do that. Spend a bit of time reviewing your things, especially given what happened, which was kind of like not even really predicted, was it? This would happen in the Hawke's Bay. Now we have that knowledge of what could happen. Yeah. What
Absolutely.
do you need to update on your end? Yeah.
So on my list is to look inside my emergency bag and just see what's in there. Check the radio. How does it work even? I don't even think I've used it. I've just got it in the bag ready to use. But how do I use it? Right. So do that. Find the batteries. Check the food that's in the cans that are, you know, it's to, what do you call that food, Jayne? The food that you have in cans that's for emergency food, I suppose.
Long life sort of
food. Long life
Yeah.
food. That's the one. Look at those things, copies of some certain documents that should also be in that pack. And just as a time to do it. If you got to do it, you got to do it. And I think that's also one of Tony's tips is it just has to be done. You just have to prepare. But doing the prep is quite easy. You just have to do it.
Yeah, recently we had Noto Peninsula, right? And something that happened there was a massive fire, right? And massive fires in Tokyo have happened before. So being able to leave your house with your most important possessions is really key, right? If
Very
you're living
much.
in Tokyo or another built up place. So yes, prepare, check your water, drinking water. Yeah, and how's your drinking water situation? Is that up to date? Is it out of date? Is it past its use by date? Time to switch those out.
Yeah.
You know, those sorts of things. Water is one of the most important things to have if you are sheltering in place after
Absolutely.
a disaster. That's for sure.
All right, let's get into it then, Jayne.
Yeah, let's hear it from Tony. Kia ora, Tony. Welcome to the Jandals in Japan podcast. Great to have you on the show today.
Good morning.
So we like to start off with our warm-up question. And our question for you is, what's your favorite Japanese food to have when you get off the plane in Japan?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. Assuming it's winter, I love the barbecue with the meat and the vegetables. Yeah, that's always a good winter treat. Summer, I suppose, summer event, I would probably go for more the teppanyaki, something like that. Yeah.
How about you, Catherine? What do you head for when you get off the plane?
Well, you all know who have been listening that when I leave Japan, I always have udon. But when I come back, I quite like going for a teishoku. I don't know if you know what that is, Tony. You know, where you've got the rice and miso soup, pickles, and then some main dish that's usually served on a tray. So
yes,
you've got all your calories there. You've got all your food groups. There's oftentimes a little bit of fruit thrown in there, little pieces of kiwi fruit or orange, but I quite like that. So it might be a tempura teishoku or a tonkatsu teishoku, depending on what I want, but I quite like how Japan does that sort of all-in-one sitting there and go for it kind of meal. Yeah. Jane, have you got something you do?
Yeah, our family likes a good tonkatsu. So that's the pork cutlet, breaded and deep fried. That is the ultimate gojiso, the sort of delicious food to have. So we probably might head to a tonkatsu shop after we get back to Japan from being away overseas.
Well, we are joined today by Tony Clifford, who's the Managing Director of Pan Pacific Forest Products Limited. PanPac is based in the Hawke's Bay and Otago region of New Zealand. It's owned by OG Green Resources, which is a subsidiary of OG Holdings Corporation in Japan. And we were so lucky to catch up with Tony in Beppu in 2022 and then again in Christchurch in 2023 during the JNZBC conference. We wanted Tony to come on the show because he's had a long connection with Japan, I think more than 30 years, even just with PanPac. And he's our first forestry focused guest for the show. Tony, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me, Bob Kitchen and Jane.
Yay. Well, tell us about where you grew up and a bit more about your background.
Sure. Well, I guess you'd call it, I'm a local boy. PanPac's head office is here in Napier. Napier's a city within the region of Hawke's Bay, and Hawke's Bay is on the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand. But came back to Hawke's Bay after having worked in Taranaki and in Australia for a few years, and been with PanPac for the last 32 years.
There you go. That's just, that you don't see that or hear that much these days with the person who stayed with one company for that length of time. Amazing. What led you then from engineering though into forestry?
Well, I probably have to tell that story backwards, where I started with PanPac, because PanPac, while we're a forestry company, we've got 35,000 hectares of Radiata pine here in Hawke's Bay. But the differentiator with PanPac is that we do have significant investment in value-added processing here in New Zealand. We've got a very large mechanical pulp mill, the largest one in New Zealand, and we have one of the largest sawmills in New Zealand producing appearance-grade Radiata pine products for export markets. So it was more that value-added processing side of the business that brought me into PanPac, and we're a very large consumer of electricity. The pulp mill uses around 500 gigawatt hours a year of electricity, so that makes us the fifth largest user of electricity in New Zealand. And so I was recruited back in 1992 as an electrical and electronics engineer, working as a project engineer. So it was more the value-added side of things that brought me into PanPac rather than forestry per se.
So tell us about your first connection with Japan and how that came about.
Very early on in my career, I was working as a graduate engineer in the oil and gas industry in Taranaki. I distinctly recall we were purchasing some very large electric motors from Hitachi in Japan. We were buying them from Hitachi, and we're getting quotes from Hitachi and also from GEC, I believe, in the UK at the time. And I can still remember the attention to detail that the Hitachi salespeople brought to the table, and notwithstanding the fact that 12,000 kilometres away and 5 hours time zone difference and a different language. So that was probably my very first interaction with the Japanese business culture anyway. And I was recalling, that was back in the days when they had telexes. And I can still remember that they actually somehow created on the telex machine that's quite restrictive. You've only got the QWERTY keys and brackets and plus minuses, but they sent a whole picture of the outline of both the plan view and a elevation view of a 1,500 kilowatt electric motor, and they managed to get that into a telex format, which I thought was incredibly creative.
That is amazing. That is wow.
That was my first dealing with Japanese company, but until then, until I came to PanPac, I hadn't really had any direct, and I had never visited Japan until I was part of the OG.
Yeah, so when was that when you first came to Japan with OG?
Well, I started in 1992, and within 1995, we started a really large expansion of our sawmill project. And obviously, with OG as being the shareholder, we needed their approval. they were very, very keen on us purchasing Japanese-based or Japanese-designed and manufactured sawmilling equipment. Unfortunately, we realised the difference in log size, weight, and specifications wouldn't probably suit the New Zealand Radiata pine logs, which are significantly bigger and heavier. But we spent a lot of time visiting sawmills all throughout Japan. In the end, we didn't purchase that equipment. We purchased North American equipment, and then we had the shareholder support for it. But that was my very first trip to Japan.
What do you remember from those days? And has something changed between then and, say, the last trips that you've had to Japan that you noticed? Or maybe something hasn't changed in
When
Japan?
was then?
1992, yes?
1992.
That was probably 1994 when
94, 95, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
94, 95, yeah.
Okay.
So, 30 years ago. Oh, look, I still very vividly remember my first visit to the Ginza. That was, an assault on the visual senses with the amount of neon signs back in those days. This is well before LED big screens and that, so they're all custom made neon signs, and the I guess you call it the lavishness of the retail stores. Marble frontages and huge doors with brass handles and doormen wearing white gloves opening the doors and that for you. And I suppose, in terms of perpetuity, you can still get that on the Ginza today in some of the large retail stores. So some things have changed, big change from neons now to massive LED screens. But no, it's still the same. Part of my journey with Panpac was I was running our remanufacturing plant for about 8 years. We made high-grade edge glue panels for export market, and we had customers or retail customers in Japan. I remember a couple of the companies were Do It Company and Joyful Honda. And I was lucky enough to visit those companies both in and around the Tokyo region and in some of the around the Kansai district. And so I had quite a few visits with them. Very, 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 very enjoyable. Probably more recently, I suppose, as I've moved into more senior management roles, most of my visits to Japan have been to the head office with Oji, which is just off the Ginza, talking to shareholders about developments and seeking approval and discussing direction of the business.
That sort of stuff hasn't changed much, I guess, too. And you're right, we've still got that bit of lavishness in Ginza area. People still open doors with white gloves. So some of those classic things about Japan haven't changed. I wanted to ask you a bit more about what you talked about before, value-added processing.
Well, yeah, our main products, obviously, as a forestry company, when you harvest a tree, you get everything comes with it. From the very, very high-value prune butt logs through to saw logs, prune logs off the top, and then there's biomass that's available as well, which we recover. And at Panpac, we're one of the few what we call fully integrated forest products companies. So we right from the seedling, we manage that through the establishment of the forest, the harvesting, bringing into our site, converting into high-value lumber products for export, and the lower-value pulp logs are converted to chip. Then the arising chips off the side of the logs that can't go into lumber also go to the pulp mill, where we make mechanical pulp. So we make up to 270,000 tonnes a year of mechanical pulp. That goes into largely now. Well, it's actually interesting, the evolutionary story of Panpac, because Panpac was built and conceived 50 years ago to produce newsprint grade pulps for the Japanese market. And up until about 5 years ago, we were still supplying newsprint grade mechanical pulps into the Oji mill and Tamakamai for newsprint manufacturing and distribution across Japan. But with the decline in demand for newsprint and increase in demand for packaging grade pulps, we've switched our pivot, that's a new name, pivoted to making packaging grade pulps. Not a lot of that reaches the Japan shores. Mostly that's destined for China, India, and Greater Asia. Our lumber business, we specifically specialise in what's known as appearance grade lumber. So it's all the lumber you can see in a finished building. And so that might be anything from furniture mouldings, architraves, doors, windows, not the structural elements, so not the studs, ears, lintels, and that's distributed around the world. And we're currently, well, after we recover from our cyclone event, we'll be back up and running and producing, over 500,000 cubic metres a year of appearance grade lumber.
If we're going around in Japan, where could we possibly see your product incorporated into things we may buy or see in Japan?
Well, actually, yeah, Catherine, the evolution since I've been a fan back for 30 years is interesting. When I started, we only had one overseas customer, and that was OG in Japan, and all of our pulp and all of our centre cans, or our flitches, we call them, went through the OG network. But in that last 30 years, we've gradually reduced the amount of products that go to Japan. And right at the moment, yeah, there's actually none of our pulp going to Japan. And I say right at the moment because things can change. But our lumber products, or the centre cans, are delivered to Japan as what we call a large square, sometimes called a Japanese square. And they get then further broken down in Japan for all manner of products. But typically, I say typically, and a bit unfortunately, low-grade applications. So that typically going to things like pallets or cable drums for civil construction, temporary civil construction. And again, there's a bit of a history there that 50 years ago, that's what Radiata pine logs were exported to New Zealand for, and they were typically used for those lower-grade applications. And in my 30 years of working in this business and selling forest products all around the world, it is really, really difficult to change the business perception of a particular species or a particular product. And I'm sure it applies to lots of products. It's not just lumber species, but once a species is being used and it sort of gets a name as a low-grade material, it's really hard to upgrade the public perception of that. Now, as distinct from our same products, exactly the same products we're sending to North America, and they're now being used in the last 10 years, they're now being used in a very, very highest grade application. And, one of the toughest usage for any timber species is joineries, in particular windows and doors, because they suffer significant stress from both moisture and movement. And, now Radiata pine is one of the preferred species in North America for doors and window and joinery, but crikey, I don't know if I'd ever crack that market in Japan. It's just deep-seated belief that Radiata pine is not suitable for high-grade applications. So to answer your question, yeah, quite happy to walk around and see that, unless you got your steel cap boots on and your hard hat, you're on a building site, you might see some New Zealand Radiata pine being sawn up there.
Oh, you don't know. I might always wear that sort of stuff out and about. But it's interesting you say. It's almost Coles to Newcastle, that story of they're sending the Pinus radiata back to America. That's quite interesting.
It is, yeah, that's right. Because the origination of the Radiata pine was Monterey in California.
Right, California, exactly.
Yeah.
I remember from my tour guiding days, I used to talk about this, Tony, to Japanese tourists around Christchurch and going up on the Summit Road where it's Pinus radiata is everywhere. But again, this unglamorous product, but it's very practical. I mean, we need pallets to move things around. And so it's actually still being used in a very practical way, even if it's not shiny like Ginza, right? It's something that we actually need.
Very much so. And one of the other qualities of Radiata pine on the service side of things, it's readily available. And, if you talk to anyone in the forest products business, they always have a preferred species. This is the best species for that, this species for that. And in my years and years of sales, the next question I always ask them, I say, is it readily available? Oh, no, it's not. So, well, are you in the business of dreaming about making stuff or really wanting to make stuff? Because if you really want to make stuff, you better hook your car to the Radiata pine trailer, because, we can make heaps of it available for you on a regular basis. And, everyone in the industry has got a kind of little saying. They say that Radiata pine is the second best species for everything. And it literally is. We don't ever claim to be the greatest species for lots of applications, but there's almost nothing you can't do with Radiata pine. And most of it's a mindset change.
Absolutely. Wow.
So, Tony, can you share some insights into the dynamics of working with Japanese owners?
I'll qualify my responses to this that all of my 30 years has been working for a Japanese corporate and a large Japanese corporate of that. And I'm pretty sure, there's probably differences when it comes to either smaller businesses or family-run businesses. So I think probably one of the main things I've really learned, and maybe as well as, there's obviously reasonably different cultures across our both business and social landscapes. And I'm not totally sure, but I think the population density has got something to do with that. If you look at New Zealand and Japan, Japan's got 25 times the population of New Zealand. We're only 5 million people here on a good day. And we've got about the same land mass. So I think part of my learning has been that the Japanese culture is very, very disciplined, very, very respectful, quite cautious, quite risk averse. And I think, some of that nature and some of those symbols, that business culture, in my opinion, sort of stem from that density and that over, thousands of years, people have had to live very closely with lots of other people. And that inherently generates quite a lot of respect for your fellow person. As distinct from New Zealand, we're sparsely populated. People live on lifestyle blocks, 5 peoples with 10 acres, and they tend to live by themselves and behave by themselves. And that tends to bring about a bit of a difference in culture. So, if I said there was, my key learning or key difference between, particularly in the business aspect, is we have to learn to be a lot more disciplined, a lot more patient. A classic example is if you're working in a sales environment and you're selling a product in New Zealand into Japan, you might have 1 or 2 people involved in the logistics side of it, organising shipping, pricing, all that sort of thing. In Japan, typically they'll have 4 or 5, maybe 6 people would be involved in that transaction, and then they all need information and they all want to be involved in the discussion. And so, that's something I've learned over the years, is that you just have to understand that there's a lot more people involved. Part of them being very risk averse is they like lots and lots of details about things before you move forward. In fact, I remember seeing a few years ago a very, very simple diagram that I think depicted it really, really clearly, and it sort of showed on the left the start line for a Japanese decision, and there was all kinds of variations. They were all over the place, and just before they got to the finish line, they had the decision made, and then there was a straight line from the decision to the finish line. And then it said, everyone else, we have a very short distance and we make a decision, and after we've made a decision, we wander all over the place until we get to the finish line, and we're quite comfortable with that. I've learned that the Japanese culture is not comfortable with that. They much prefer to eliminate a lot of the variability and a lot of the uncertainty and a lot of the risks before you make a commitment and a decision to move. And so I guess how that exhibits itself then in business is when you're sitting on the Kiwi side or the New Zealand side of the Pacific, it appears that things take a long time to get decisions made. Probably ultimately the time to get to the end goal is not a lot different, but the Kiwi nature is just wanting to get on with it and not too much faffing around with details. And then we're quite comfortable with things not going to plan, and we just adapt and hold to whatever's needed to get to the goalpost. But that's definitely not, in my experience, that's not well liked or well understood in the Japanese business culture.
Right. And in your reflections for today, was there any sort of memorable experience that came up for you about how, something that successfully worked out, and that even that timeline where it took a lot to get at the front end, but you got there in the end? Maybe it was something that was quite unexpected or funny or, just delightful that happened for you.
Well, I think if I even go right back to that 1994 event when we were, selecting sawmilling equipment for our sawmill expansion, that there was a significant amount of interest, I'd call it pressure, from our shareholder, or elements within our shareholder, to purchase equipment made in Japan. But we did the trials, and we went all around the world. Went to North America, including Canada, and right down to the southern states of North America. And we travelled around Japan and gathered all the information on the ability of the equipment, and we presented that to the shareholder. And after some pretty tense meetings, and it's only a Japanese meeting where nothing can be said for nearly 5 minutes, and a lot of people who haven't ever had a business meeting with Japanese find that incredibly unsettling, and they just can't resist saying something. But after a while, you learn, you just stay silent. And in the end, they accepted the validation of our data, and we moved forward with the decision. So that was a good experience. And more recently, I'm not, as you're aware, with Pampac as a company and many other companies in Hawke's Bay, we recently suffered a pretty debilitating cyclone and flooding event. And immediately after that, there was genuine concern from the shareholder about the well-being of the people. I was expecting a query about how much the plant was damaged and how much it's going to cost and how long, but the first few days of questions were nothing but about the people. And so that was very refreshing and quite memorable.
Indeed, that just gave me shivers when you said that people care about people first. And we have quite a number of disasters in both New Zealand and Japan, and it's always the people that Japan thinks about first. Of course, getting the infrastructure back on, getting transportation and everything, but caring about the people. And so while we're there, Tony, how has the recovery been from Cyclone Gabrielle? And is there anything that perhaps some of our listeners could do to help? Because we had fundraising at the very start, back in February, March, April last year. How about now? Give us a rundown.
Well, so as the listeners can understand, what we suffered here was Cyclone Gabrielle delivered over 600 millimetres of rain into the catchment behind our Whirinaki site, which is nearly an area of 255 square kilometres. And so we ended up experiencing about a 1 in 200 year flood event down the East Valley. And that resulted in nearly 2 metres of silted water right through our site, which is nearly 40 hectares. When the water finally receded, we're left with nearly 500 millimetres of silt inside every building, every piece of plant, every electrical switchboard, every vehicle, every forklift, every nook and cranny of the site. We've had to move more than 200,000 cubic metres of silt off our site. Across Hawke's Bay, it's probably been more than 10 million cubic metres of silt removed off sites. But look, we were really fortunate. We didn't have any loss of life. We hibernated the site 24 hours before the event. Right now, 12 months later, we have got our sawmill up and running. It's running at about 80%. We've got our chip mill running, got one of our boilers running. And in about another 3 weeks, we should have our pulp mill up and running, which will be quite a milestone event. And having said that, it's probably going to take until November this year, 2024, until we get the pulp mill right back up to full capacity, just due to the amount of equipment damaged. I think to answer your question, what can people do to help? I guess under any of these kind of events, I think just thinking about people's well-being and things like that and calling that out is really important. But probably one lesson I can share, and I suppose listeners to help themselves would be, I would highly recommend that businesses, or even at a personal level, that you start to plan for some kind of a crisis. It's very hard to predict natural events such like an earthquake or a tsunami, those types of things, but severe weather events are just as debilitating, and they're quite predictable now. The ability for weather forecasting to tell you when you're going to get these kind of rainfalls is predictable. So, I think, in these cases for severe weather events, you've probably got a 48-hour window maybe where you can plan and try and mitigate the effect. And fortunately for us, we've done 2 simulations of crises. We did one in 2020 and one in 2021, where we actually simulate in an accelerated time environment and an event. And actually one of them was an earthquake, and ironically one of them was a flood. And so our senior leadership team, or our crisis management team, had actually prepared that, and we prepared lots of documentation and stuff like that to use, and we all knew what everyone's role was. So in that first 48 hours after the flood back in February 23, I believe we were probably about as efficient as we could be. We knew what to do. And we spent very, very little time arguing about what to do. It was just a case of getting on with things and following those simulations. So, yeah, prepare for an event like that. It's not that hard. You just need to have some documentation. People need to know what to do, and then it's very efficient on the day. So that'd be my recommendation to listeners.
Excellent advice, right? Get your business continuity plans in place. And as you said,
Yes.
it doesn't take long to actually do it. You've just got to do it. And
That's right. Yep.
you hit the button there with that, knowing what your role is, because the time delays that can happen, right? With somebody, what am I going to do? Who's doing what? Who to go to? If you've got that sorted, it's far easier. Super, super great.
Well, the other key thing is you need to assume under earthquake, tsunami, or severe weather event that you're not going to have normal communication. So in Hawke's Bay here, we didn't have any electricity to the whole of the region for nearly a week, and cell phone tower batteries get exhausted after about 6 hours. So you're actually not only operating in a crisis, but you don't have any of your normal tools at hand. You don't have cell phones yet. None of the petrol stations could pump petrol out of the ground, so there was, after a couple of days, there was no fuel. So it's not just you're dealing with the crisis, you're actually dealing with complete loss of your toolkit that you're used to having around you on a day-to-day basis.
Well, she must have really learnt a lot through that and been able to even improve for potentially next time, given all of that things you probably hadn't guessed that, well, you can't get petrol and cell phones are down. Whoops, didn't know that was, you really can't imagine until you're in it, right?
Absolutely, yeah. No, you wouldn't want to do another one again. So, you wonder about the value of that learning, but more than happy to share our knowledge with other companies or people.
That resilience
resilience
that you've built is fantastic. And please do share with others who have not had the experience, that's for sure.
Sure.
So, Tony, could you share one gem with us that you think is the single most valuable piece of advice or top tip for listeners who are wanting to thrive in both New Zealand and Japan business landscapes?
I think the key thing would be, as I've already touched on, the decision-making process and the hierarchical nature of Japanese business. You need to understand you're not going to change that. So, the response to that is you have to be quite patient, and I think you have to go well prepared. If you turn up either as trying to sell a product or wanting to buy a product, and you're sort of doing it off the cuff, how you might have done going to Australia or North America or even other parts of Asia, you're probably going to end up with a lukewarm reception in Japan. You won't know that though. You'll get the most gracious hosts, and they will be very, very accommodating and tell you everything. But then in 3 months' time, you'll wonder why the business hasn't gone anywhere, and that'll be it. That they will have seen, or you will have portrayed an image of being underprepared, not thought through details, and probably in a rush. And those 3 categories don't fit with the Japan business culture. If you had to put it into simple words here, be prepared and be patient. And then I think once you have established relationships, either as a purchasing or a sales environment, you can probably enjoy very many, many years of repeat business and very good business and probably very enjoyable business. That would be my gem.
It is such a gem. Thank you for that. It's fantastic. How about crystal ball? Focus on the crystal ball now for the future. Any insights in the business landscape that you are seeing?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because if I can find my, I suppose my thoughts to business, one thing I guess I've observed over the last 5 years has been sort of a change in our currency positions, and the ability to trade within and between companies and countries is very, very dependent on your currency strength or weakness. And, in the last, I suppose, 5 years, the yen has weakened nearly 35% against the US dollar. And in the same time period, the Kiwi has only weakened about 10%. So effectively, the Kiwi cross rate strengthened by nearly, 23 to 25%. And that's been very, very steady. It's not random. It's actually a pretty strong mega trend. What I do see there is that I think the first opportunity's got to be for tourism. Kiwis and Aussies travelling to Japan need to realise it's significantly more affordable now than what it was 5 years ago. And you combine that with the lack of inflation in Japan. And, my references now, a really, really nice hotel room, not far from the Ginza, is about the same price as a hotel room in Auckland. And 20 years ago, that was not the case. It was eye-watering when you're filling as an expense claim when you travel back from Japan. And then, of course, the reverse of that is an export basis from Japan. We used to have significant amount of Japanese manufactured goods in New Zealand, particularly a lot of cars and vehicles, electronic consumer goods, tools. I still believe Japan makes the best hand tools in the world. I always buy them and somehow sneak them back into my luggage on the way back from Japan. So I think those opportunities are arising, but people may not have noticed that sort of mega trend that's happened in the last 5 years, a very, very steadily weakening of the yen against the New Zealand dollar. In terms of challenges, I don't think there's a heck of a lot of challenges there. Well, obviously, our two islands are, 12,000 kilometres apart and 12 hours flight. But as I say to people, New Zealand's 12 hours from everywhere. So if you're going to get on a plane, you may as well go to Japan as go to LA or Hong Kong or Shanghai.
You said it.
Or Singapore.
Stay in almost the same time zone. Yep.
It is, yeah. Yes. And I think there's some opportunities there. That would be my crystal ball moment, probably driven by that currency. And if the yen was to weaken to 100 yen to the New Zealand dollar, it would make the currency conversions really simple. When you're looking at a menu, you just knock off a couple of zeros and there you've got it in New Zealand dollars. It's not quite there yet. It's a 93. It's a little bit hard to divide by 93.
No, right. Thank you so much for calling out the currency matter. I'm not sure that anyone's really directly talked about that recently. So really like that. You pulled that one out. And you must have prepared something else probably before we talked today, Tony. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
Yeah, one thing I did forget to mention is, to manage that business difference, we always have seconded Japanese employees within the pancake business. And they provide a fabulous interface and not just translation and interpretation, but a really, really important resource in terms of explaining to us in New Zealand how the Japanese culture works and how the Japanese method works. So, that'd be another recommendation to anyone embarking on a moderate-sized business would be to try and engage a Japanese native person into your business in New Zealand that can help you out with those things. I'm pretty sure it would grease the rails really, really well in terms of getting business underway in Japan.
So, Tony, you've mentioned the silence in meetings. What do you think's happening during those silences? It's not nothing, right? It's not just silence and nobody knows the answer. What do you think's going on when there's this prolonged silences that we foreigners want to fill with chatter? Any ideas? I'm just curious. What you think?
Well, I guess, silence usually occurs in a meeting after there's been probably a point of difference. So you've got to a certain point in a meeting where, you may have agreed on 3 things out of 4, and the 4th thing you can't quite get agreement on. And that's what usually triggers what I would call a giant pregnant pause that can just seems to last forever. And I think what's going on in the Kiwis' head is like, what the heck's happening? What do I speak, do I not speak? I don't know. In the Japanese mind, I think they're probably thinking of a way to say no politely, or thinking of a way that you can move forward in the conversation such that decision point or that point of difference doesn't become a roadblock. Yes, I think they're sort of postulating on how they may be able to respond when they're really saying, we're not moving on this point, so we've got to find a way forward. So I don't know. What do you think, Jayne? You must have
I'm just curious. I'm just want to see what you might have thought was going on. And I'd love to hear from Catherine as well. What do you think is going on in those silences, Catherine, from your experience?
Could be all sorts of things. Like they might be indeed thinking about how they can refuse you on that last one, but they might also be thinking about the pressure of time to do the negotiation, but they want more time to think about that other one thing. It's not an absolute no, but they want to try and make it work, but they need more time but how do we ask for more time? We've got no more time. We're trying to get this deal done. So there could be that as well.
Yeah, they could be.
Also, there's sometimes just processing the words and the body language they've just seen in front of them. So it's often it's as simple as that, just processing something and really understanding and thinking about the language that's been used. It could be that as well.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I guess the other little tip, you need to take away from meetings, Japanese business meetings, is after you've explained something and you've done your 20 PowerPoint slides and you got to the end and then everyone notes and says, yes, that does not mean they agreed. That just means, yes, I heard you. And often
I hear you. Yeah.
I've heard people walk away from meetings and they said, oh, yes, no, everyone nodded and said, yes. I said, that doesn't necessarily mean they've agreed with your position. I've just said, yes, we've heard you. And it took me many years to learn that.
And I think too, that's a good point. But if it was an absolute no, then you would get the, oh, that's difficult reply, perhaps, right? You'd get quite soon, you would get a, chotto muzukashii desu. That's a little bit difficult. Then you sort of know it's a no. So I feel if it's an absolute no, you're going to get the, it's difficult. Yes. But in just reversing that situation without filling in a gap for Japanese people and just wanting to talk, could we do something more proactive or positive? Could we say, so do you need some more time to think about that? Or would you like to have the room to yourselves while we move out and give you some time to discuss? Or is there something else we could do in that moment, do you think, Tony?
Possibly. I think that probably a suggestion about, is would you like some more time or would you like some time in private to discuss this matter is possible. But I still think it's just part of business, Japanese business culture. It just happened. They end, and then you move on with the meeting. I've never been in one where it's fatal, but it's just, if you haven't been in one of those meetings before where there's almost 4 or 5 minutes when no one says anything, it's pretty unusual for a Westerner. And so you just got to learn to ride through it. You definitely don't take out your phone and start flicking through that, or get your laptop out and start answering emails. That would be very disrespectful. You just have to look at your papers and
pretend you're thinking as well and considering, and because it is group considering time, isn't it? Everybody's considering together how this might go.
Absolutely, and it definitely comes back to that business culture of wanting to de-risk things, because variations to plan after an approval have very, very low tolerance in Japan. So they're typically thinking about what could go wrong here, and if it did go wrong, how would I explain that? I can't explain it, therefore I don't want it to go wrong. Therefore, let's make sure things are certain before we move on.
It's two different ways of approaching things. As you said quite well before, was that we end up at the same place, probably taking the same amount of time, but it's a different approach. But neither's bad or good, right? It's just different.
That's right. No, it's just
excellent.
Different.
Well, we've really enjoyed speaking with you today, Tony. Thank you so much for sharing your gems, your crystal balls, and all the other comments and things that you've told us about. We really hope for the very, very best for your recovery, continued recovery. We're super happy to hear how much has already been done on a massive scale, even in just 1 year. So we look forward to helping you further, and we hope we see you in Kurashiki in November this year.
Oh, definitely, that's the plan, to be there. And no, look, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about it. It's the first time in 30 years anyone's asked me about my learning. From
pleasure
in this environment. Yes, and I hope people find it interesting. I do qualify, so I requalify my comments that it is 30 years working for a large Japanese corporate company. My learnings, observations, and experience are very much covered by that.
Of course, we understand that, and there's all kinds of different sized businesses, but 30 years, think about that. That is a long time. Thank you so much, Tony. You are now officially a Jandal in Japan. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Kia ora.
Wow, what a fantastic insight into the wood pulp industry in New Zealand. Oh my God.
So many things I did not know.
Right?
Yeah. And that's the whole point, isn't it? That we want to make sure that we can not only self-educate, but have others understand some of the things that are quite normal and natural in everyday life in New Zealand that really impact and influence business in Japan and the interactions between both countries. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, well, I know now that Radiata pine is the wood, right? Who knew?
I would. And I remember screaming around in the bus with tourists going up, as I said, the Summit Road, and we would talk about this. And it was just, this is introduced from California. It grows at 3 times the speed of any other wood in New Zealand, the native wood. So this is what we grow here, and we export it to other countries, including Japan. That was kind of what I said. I could have had a whole lot more had I met Tony earlier on.
Yes, right.
There we go.
You could have changed some perceptions about Radiata pine right there on the tour bus.
I could have. There we go. But it feels full circle talking with him today. But I loved that he brought out some of those interesting things that even, talking about Japanese patience and respectfulness and disciplined behavior comes from a population density perspective. I don't think we've had anyone talk about that.
Nobody's mentioned that, have they?
No one has mentioned that.
Yeah, but if you live here, you can see how that plays out, right? You are very close to your neighbours. New Zealanders cannot conceive how close people live together, right? It's just, they're right
Be
there.
careful.
Yeah.
And even on the train, you stand very closely together, but not so that you are right on somebody. You still have a kind of space or feel like you have a space. It's very interesting. And I thought his perspectives too on silence, that was a really amazing
That was a good one,
insight, wasn't it? How to bear through the silences in meetings and not jump in with your Kiwiness to try and fill the gap.
Do you remember your first silent meeting?
Yeah, just fill it with something and think that had to be filled. But actually, I think there's lots of theories and research done now that you should at least wait 45 seconds for anyone to answer something, let alone it's somebody without having English or Japanese as their native language. So always do a 45-second pause. And that feels like a long
eternity.
Time.
Yeah.
Long
when
time.
You're waiting, it's an eternity. Yes. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. I think you can definitely build your muscle on this. Is the more you do it, the more you're around it. You're like, oh, okay, everyone's just having a little think. We're having a little think together here. And that's a perfectly valid way to spend our time. Whereas in another location, country, culture, it might be like, are we wasting our time here? Nobody's saying anything. What's going on? Can we move to the next thing? What's that? But it's like, okay, we're just all spending this time together to think about this, and then we'll all together move on to the next thing. That's perfectly valid.
Yeah. And as we have been mentioning, planning for crisis as well, I think was that other really great point that nobody's really brought out, is that we know we are both countries of natural disasters, but some of these weather conditions we can predict these days. And doing your BCP, your business continuity plan, and actually thinking about who can do what, I think it's very timely to hear that information today. As we know, it's this episode's coming out round about the time of some anniversaries of natural disasters in both countries. So it's really great that Tony mentioned that today.
Yeah, and like you said, he's happy to share his learnings of his unfortunately having to learn and practice the hard way. But that is such a great wealth of knowledge that is there. And I also know from my own experience of having lived through natural disasters here in Fukushima, I'm happy to share that experience with others, whether it's in your personal life or that you can use in your business. Please ask, because we have been there and done that and experienced things that you can't imagine. You just can't imagine if you've never been in one of these. Yeah. Use that. Reach out to Tony, reach out to whoever can help you. Because being prepared means you can not relax, but be confident that you know what to do. Or you can pivot easily when you do need to do something. So because it really is great.
That something like that happens, people stop and think, well, don't think. They don't know what to do. Who's doing what? And I thought his point on, we knew our roles. So we knew what we were doing. And that was really critical, obviously, for their amazing way that they prepared for that.
Hit the ground running when they
water that was going to fall down, right? So excellent information. And maybe there's a playbook Tony could put out, for other naturally based production companies in New Zealand or even in Japan, ways and means of sharing that advice between each other. of how you can plan for crisis. It was really great to hear that. Thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you, Tony. It was great to see you and to speak with you. And I can't believe nobody's asked him in 30 years. He said that at the end, right?
Oh.
Nobody's asked him about all of this knowledge and experience he's had. Yay, us for asking Tony to come on the Jandals in Japan
the
podcast.
Jandals in Japan podcast to ask him. Thanks so much, Tony. And we've got some more others coming next too, Jayne, right?
Yes, we have. So many industries for us to learn about and to teach you about at the same time. So keep on listening.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our guests' links in the show notes.
This podcast is brought to you today by Catherine O'Connell Law and Pod Launch with Jayne. If you have a great story you think should be on the show, come and find us on LinkedIn or Instagram. We'd love to hear from you. See you next time.
Mata ne!